Good evening. My name is Sarah Donahue, and I am the Education Curator at the Wingate Museum of Art at Hendrix College. Thank you for joining us for this evening's program, which is part of the Let Us March On exhibition. This exhibition includes a rich mix of documentary photographs, artworks, artifacts, interactives, and narrative text, which document and contextualize the Black Lives Matter movement in Arkansas. Let Us March On was guest curated by Stephanie Sims and is on view 24/7 in our window gallery through January 22nd. You will also find a video tour of the exhibition on the museum website at wingatemuseum.org. While we are hosting this evening's program virtually, we want to acknowledge that the Wingate Museum of Art at Hendrix College occupies the traditional homelands of the Osage, Quapaw, and Caddo. We offer respect and gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who have cared for the land over generations. I am pleased to introduce our moderator for this conversation. Dr. Sasha Pfau is a professor of history at Hendrix College, where she teaches medieval and early modern European history. Her book, Medieval Communities and the Mad, Narratives of Crime and Mental Illness in Late Medieval France, was released just yesterday and focuses on the ways that medieval communities identified and dealt with mental illness. She has a wide-ranging interest in human health and disease and has taught multiple courses on pre-modern medicine and epidemics, both in the history department and in collaboration with biologist Dr. Laura McDonald as part of their first-year experience course, The Engaged Citizen. Thank you for being with us tonight, Sasha. I will turn the rest of the program over to you now.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I am so excited to have an opportunity to talk with our three speakers about this really important and timely issue tonight. So I'll start by introducing our three panelists and then ask them to tell us a little bit about their work. And I'll go in alphabetical order by last name. So Brian Mitchell is a native of New Orleans, Louisiana, who moved to Central Arkansas by way of Hurricane Katrina. He is an assistant professor of history at the University of Arkansas Little Rock and an associate faculty member at the Anderson Institute on Race and Ethnicity. Brian's research primarily deals with race and violence and the Elaine Massacre. Prior to joining UA Little Rock, Mitchell was a decorated senior federal investigator at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and winner of the Federal Investigator of the Year Award. A graduate of the University of New Orleans, he received an MA in history, an MS in urban studies, and a PhD in urban studies with a concentration in public history. Christina Schutt is the executive director for the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center, the African American Museum of History and Culture for the state of Arkansas. Under Christina's leadership, the center was awarded first-time National Museum accreditation, making it only the 9th Black culture museum in the United States to receive this designation. Prior to her tenure at Mosaic Templars Cultural Center, she served as Associate Librarian for Special Collections and Instruction at Hendrix College, where she worked with our students on a number of really excellent projects. She has also served as an archivist for notable collections ranging from the history of medicine at Harvard University to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. papers. Christina earned a bachelor's degree in history from Central Methodist University and holds master's degrees in archival management and history with an emphasis on collective memory and public representations from Simmons University. Finally, our third speaker tonight, Stephanie Sims, is the museum director and curator for the University Museum and Cultural Center at the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, and is the guest curator of the Wingate Museum of Art at Hendrix College's Let Us March On exhibition. Previously, she was an archivist for the Clinton Foundation, where she managed former President William J. Clinton's collection of personal papers and artifacts, and assisted with multiple exhibit installations. Stephanie obtained her bachelor's degree in visual arts from the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff and received her master's degree in public history from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. So I know that each of you have been researching and documenting the Black experience with COVID-19 and more generally the Black experience of 2020 from different perspectives. So I thought we might start by just telling us a little bit about your projects. And Stephanie, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you so much for the introduction, and it's an honor to be on this panel discussion with such great people. But my project was actually the exhibit itself, and pretty much we had to cover the entire protests and the demonstrations after the killing of George Floyd. And so pretty much with all of the protests going on top of us being in the middle of a pandemic, in a lot of cases where we actually had increase in people actually obtaining the virus, there was a lot of kind of blame on the protests being a reason why we had a rise in cases. And so this exhibit actually shows where even where everyone is out in the protest, they're still following CDC guidelines with wearing the mask, even though if they are in close contact with everyone. So pretty much this exhibit just kind of gave kind of like a truth serum, just put everything out there so people can understand what it was like as an African American during this situation and during this unprecedented time.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Christina?
Yeah, thanks, Sasha, and thanks for to everybody else on the panel. This is great. So I always like to start with our mission, which is to preserve, interpret, and celebrate African American history and culture in Arkansas. And so as a museum, we're really committed to that work and looking at it in all sorts of different lenses. We often think about it through the viewpoint of telling untold stories. Sometimes we're even telling stories that people don't want told or don't want heard. And that's a huge part of the work that we do. And so it was a natural fit for us back in February and March, when we went home. One of the first conversations that I had with my team was, how are we going to document this and document what's happening in this state? Because I know from having worked in the archives that the typical excuse for why the African American experience isn't as well documented, particularly, nowadays in secondary sources, we're seeing more of it, but is because they'll say, oh, well, there's a lacking of primary sources. And so we want to provide future historians with that information. The other piece of this for us, or I should say, so what really comes out of this is this project that we call COVID in Black, which is designed to solicit ideas, to solicit stories, to solicit objects from the community in the hopes of, at some point maybe building an exhibit, but first and foremost, really documenting. The other piece about this, so maybe about a week or so after the George Floyd killing, I came together with the curatorial team, and we put together an exhibit, kind of a pop-up exhibit called A Change is Gonna Come. And really it was us reflecting on objects within our collection which talk about the long struggle, that it wasn't just an overnight that we've seen protests erupt in this country, but that African Americans have been fighting for their freedom and fighting for and against injustice since they first landed here in 1619. That the mythology of history is that it just started with Rosa Parks, or it started with Martin Luther King, or it started with George Floyd. But the reality of it is that there's a long history. And so we wanted to, again, to contextualize that for people and help them understand just the true history, as Stephanie so alluded to it earlier.
That's great. Thanks, Christina. Brian? You're muted.
I'm working on COVID in Black with Christina. I'll be doing many of the interviews and putting together some of the narrative that will go along with the digital project, the Digital Humanities Project. That's a component of COVID in Black. So the demographics I'm looking at, when we talk about disparities, we have to put meaning to those disparities. So how much more likely are African Americans in this very first year? Because it seems as though the pandemic itself will go beyond the length of the project. So we'll largely be looking at the first year. What did we do in preparation for the pandemic and its arrival here? And what did we do after March? What did we do after March 11th, when that first individual came into the state with COVID? How did COVID affect the African American community? And we want to make sure that we keep a record of this narrative. And the reason that's so important is when we look back to the Great Influenza, there was very little emphasis put on the marginalized communities and the communities of color in the United States. So we have no real measurement of how those communities were affected and whether or not those communities were disparately affected. So we want to make sure that this time around there is a record, there is some account, some discussion of how Black communities have fared and what the pandemic has meant to them, both in economic terms and in health terms.
This is a great project. I'm really interested in all of the different layers of your work. And I would like to welcome the audience to add questions if you have some things that you'd like to hear about more from our panelists. In the meantime, I'd like to pick up on something that both Brian and Christina were talking about, which is this idea that, historically race and class have played significant roles in the impact of epidemic disease. And that's not just because of differences in access to healthcare, but also because of differences in ability to practice recommended safety measures, isolating or removing oneself from areas where disease is spreading, right? That was something that was really common even as early as the medieval and early modern period that I study. But that's something that you can only do if you have the resources that can allow you to do it. Then also things like access to clean water, access to public health infrastructures more generally. So are there ways that we've seen that manifesting in our current outbreak?
Most definitely. There have been similarities that we can draw between those medieval outbreaks and the current one. And one is occupation. So African Americans are far more likely to be in the service industry. They're far more likely to be in the hospitality industry. Those industries were hit very hard in a number of ways. First, those who were lucky enough to have kept their jobs and not been laid off are in contact with many more people than the average person who's quarantined or working from home. So the likelihood of transmission is increased substantially. And then when we talk about unemployment, I wrote down some metrics that I pulled up. In May of 2020, the unemployment rates for people in that sector, the hospitality and leisure sector, was 35%. So greater than 1 in 3 people in that sector are unemployed. Last year, 2019, at the same time, only 5% of that sector was unemployed. That sector saw the largest growth than any other occupational sector in the country. Also is the necessity for childcare. And this gives them additional risk as their children, they can't afford to have their children stay home. They can't afford to stay home with their children. And with their children going back to school, there's an increased risk that they'll be bringing home COVID from the schools that they're attending.
Yeah, we've heard so many stories that reflect those statistics exactly, where parents are talking about just the struggle of both trying to work and trying to keep their kid either in school, or if the schools, because of COVID outbreaks, are having to do virtual, trying to have their kids do virtual. I think in Arkansas in particular, and especially rural communities of Arkansas, there's always been an issue of reliable internet access, and especially high-speed internet access. And so now you've got that compounded on top of. So really, I think what we've seen in particular is that the pandemic has exacerbated problems that were already there. It's put a greater spotlight on those issues, and put a greater kind of highlight on some of those issues. But I think the interesting thing is that we've also gotten to see how truly creative people have gotten in the way in which they've handled it. We often at the museum will talk about that you don't just have oppression, you also have survival, that those two things are woven together. And so to see the photos of people that people share of like doing their drive-in church service is super fascinating, right? Because you see all of the creative ways that people are trying to manage, even in the midst of a pandemic.
There are also the issues of economic indicators that are widening disparities. There were already historic disparities between the Black and white community in regard to wealth, in regard to education, and the pandemic is just widening those gaps. African American families are far more likely to be families losing their houses. They're far more likely to be families that are missing a mortgage payment. They're far more likely to be in a job sector where they're going to be laid off. And the availability to working online, they're not in fields where they can work online from home. Their fields are service mainly, or teaching, so they're going to be direct contact fields.
Yeah, those all seem like clear ways in which we're seeing sort of historical patterns being followed again. One of the things that has been so interesting about 2020, or at least earlier during this pandemic, is that we have seen, like the exhibit shows us, people coming out and coming together to protest. And I feel like we might expect that during a time of pandemic, people would be much less willing to gather and much less willing to come out and put themselves on the line for issues that matter to them. And so why were people willing to come out? Do you think people coming out despite the pandemic, or do you think that the pandemic actually made people more willing or more aware and more likely to participate in these movements? Stephanie, do you have any thoughts on that?
I actually have a lot of thoughts on it. And the thing is I could be wrong in some of my opinion about some of it, but what kind of stuck out to me is that it was really a wake-up call to a lot of people. In many cases where it actually brought discussion. So, and a lot of times when you have just, for instance, with Trayvon Martin, we were devastated, because he looked like our nephew or our cousin or even our son. So we've already been feeling this way. So when this happens, and when the video went viral and everyone gets the chance to see what happened from start to finish, it sparked conversation. So another thing is a lot of people kind of got a little tired of staying indoors. But so, if it was an opportunity to fight and to support the movement, they knew that they can put on their mask and they can go out and do that. But I really believe that the pandemic actually gave people the opportunity to really just sit and really think about what's going on, actually pay attention. Also, we noticed a huge wave of different corporations and it's who kind of started speaking out with even with the black squares or having a stand that mentions, hey, that this is wrong. We support the movement, and it just kind of everybody just kind of followed line with that. So it was a lot of different things that actually sparked that. I don't think we can really narrow it down to one, but that's just what I believe as far as that. And if anyone else has anything that kind of stands out, please, please add to it.
Yeah, I think that the pandemic sort of acted synergistically with the protests in that there were lots of people all the time with all the other killings that would have liked to have been able to do something in an activist setting or a point of advocacy, but they had work or they had school. And now that they have nothing to do, they had an opportunity, not for one day, but to keep going out. And this encouraged others to keep going, to join them and keep going out. And then there were marches and whole sectors of people. I remember teachers came out one day, and students were, I've seen many of my students that were very, very active in the protests and in the creation of murals after the protests. So I think that all of these things sort of acted together. There was a lot of cabin fever, people being at home and locked up constantly. And that did nothing but encourage more people to come out and become more active.
I also don't think we can underestimate things that the prevalence of marches in the last, I would say, 4 years, right? We think back to the Women's March, the March for Science, like all of these large scale marches that are being done and covered, right, by news organizations across the country. There's something to that, right? When you see that on television, when you see people in Paris, France, right, marching for an American citizen. And so I think there's something to that as well in terms of the prevalence and the somewhat diversity, right, of people on the streets. We're seeing probably a more diverse crowd than we had previously, but yeah.
That's one of the things that I think makes this project even more interesting, because not only will people be talking about what they're not doing, not going to the store or not going to school, they will also be talking about their participation in these historic events that took place. Where were you when the marches were going on? Do you have a T-shirt? Do you have your poster? Do you have your mask that you wore there? Do you have pictures of yourself at these protests? And many individuals have noted that they're willing to share these sort of artifacts and images with us to incorporate that into the project.
I just have one more thing that I would like to add. Like what we talked about earlier with everyone being at home and during quarantine, a lot of people became creative. That was also the case with the protests as well. You had a lot of people who were afraid to actually participate physically in the march because they were afraid of, actually contracting COVID. So a lot of times they actually reached out to a lot of different organizations where they can actually send money where like, okay, let's see if I can support financially with this movement. That way I am a part of the movement. Even if it's where you had a lot of people that were making masks and giving them out to the people in the crowd. There were people out there who actually gave bottled water, and they made the solutions with the milk in the bottle. So in case you did get pepper sprayed, you can flush your eyes and things of that nature. Everybody found some kind of way to participate. Even if it wasn't the traditional way, people were still involved.
And that's one of the things I really enjoy about the exhibit at Hendricks right now is we have some of those kinds of physical artifacts of these marches, and we can see the photos of people, and it's really quite a moving experience to walk around and see all of that.
I also believe that people had time, and when I say people, African Americans have always sort of paused and watched the news when there were these deaths and followed the storylines, and the storylines through social media were passed through our threads. But I think the nation as a whole, and the world as a whole, had the time to sort of digest the story and watch the story develop and see the injustice that was taking place. And there was a loud, a great amount of outrage, not just in the Black community, but in the nation and the world as a whole. People saw this and they followed the story and they wanted to do something and they had the time to do it.
It seems odd to think that the pandemic actually helped the movement in that sense, but it does kind of feel like, even at the level of having the time to read the stories, to read the Facebook posts, to get upset and to hear about something that's happening in your town and then go and join it. Maybe the fact that we were all suffering from the fear of the pandemic and the need to isolate actually gave us that time and that opportunity to make those actions real.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that, as you were saying, I thought about the modern civil rights movement, right? And what it was to see these nonviolent protesters walking across, the Pettus Bridge and other places, and having dogs put on them, having fire hoses, and the ways in which that shaped and changed Americans' perception. One of the most powerful images of Central High School, right, is one of the little organizers sitting on a park, sitting on a bus bench waiting, right, with the angry white mob of citizens council members around her. And that does something to people, right? There's a certain, I think, personalization of that story. And I think that, and the civil rights movement was good, right? And one of the things they did really well was capture that in a way for Americans. In addition to that, at that time, right, they were also using things like the rhetoric of the Cold War, right, and about being an American and what it means to be an American. And I've even seen some of that come back into play, right, in the way people talk about, George Floyd or others, or think about Breonna Taylor, right? She was a daughter, right? She was someone's daughter. And I've heard that repeatedly. And so, again, that idea of humanizing, of capturing that story and making it relatable to people, I think does something, right, in your spirit, right? To good people, they reach out to that. They feel like that's an unjust system, right? That's an unjust death. And that's a totally different level for many folks in America than a statistic is, right? It's one thing to say that, African Americans or, most recently, right, Marshallese Islanders right here in Arkansas are dying at a higher rate than whites in the state. But it's different if you hear a personal story, right? If you hear the story of someone who's working on the front line at a chicken plant, and you're hearing about their family and having to quarantine or getting COVID and their intergenerational community getting sick. And so I think it carries different weights for people.
Yes, definitely. And it feels like that's the work of historians and archivists and museum curators, right? To give us that access to those narratives, to that connection to humans.
Right.
I have a kind of an interesting question that I started thinking about actually just earlier today. Brian, I know you have done research on the Elaine massacre, and that racial violence of 1919 and the early 1920s has often been contextualized in the light of the First World War, but I don't know a lot about it, but I haven't actually seen much discussion of the fact that it also happened in the wake of the influenza epidemic of 1918 and 1919. So I was wondering whether you thought that disease actually played a role in escalating tensions at that time. You're muted.
I don't believe that the disease itself played a significant role in escalating the violence. I think that it was more coming back from the war and individuals believing that they were now invested. And quite honestly, they were told that they would be invested with full citizenry when they returned from the war for their participation. And they believe this. And when they return, they are told that they're not citizens. And now the nation becomes polarized around this issue. And people are willing to use violence to have their way. And I believe that there was a similar sentiment in the nation during the recent upheavals and the recent struggles that we've had, where facets of the community feel as though they're losing their grip on the country. And in order to hold the country, they must resort to more drastic measures. And honestly, I was very concerned about the this past election, presidential election, whether it would erupt at some point, particularly if those who felt entitled to winning did not win.
Yes, we were discussing before we started the official version of the panel that it has been so far, there haven't been those acts of violence in relation to the election. But obviously, some of these peaceful protests were met with violence to try to disperse them. And that has been troubling for sure. We have a question from the audience. In collecting people's stories, what's something you've heard that has surprised you or that has been unexpected?
The number of people who have quite bravely gone back to work, and we don't really think of the sacrifices that we're asking the people that have the least to make. Many of the individuals who are returning back to work or elected to return back to work are risking not only their health, but the health of their families. And they must do this because they have no other choice. For a while, we were paying them additional pay. That additional pay has disappeared for most of the individuals who were doing that necessary work, but that risk is still there. And in fact, the risk is greater now than when they were first paying them additional monies to go back to work.
I think for us, for me, one of the things that has been maybe surprising or unexpected, I mean, definitely echoing what Brian said about people having to go back to work, but I also think the ways in which people have been trying to teach their children. So I'm amazed at all of the ways in which people are really questioning where, maybe a year ago or 2 years ago, people wouldn't have questioned the curriculum, the history curriculum, for example, that their children were taught in schools. But now that they're seeing exactly what their children are taught or the way in which their children are taught, and it's not necessarily a fault, right, directed. It is what it is, but they're seeing the textbooks, right, that their children read, and seeing the perception or the way that the stories are presented. I think that we've seen a lot of parents reach out and want to learn more history and learn it from different perspectives, right, to learn more about women and their role in history, or African Americans and their role in history in a way that maybe parents weren't as interested. The teachers were always looking for those resources, but parents have definitely taken more of an interest and more of a role in that. And in some cases, I have colleagues in other states that run African American history museums, and they often share stories about how they've got parents that are designing curriculum, right? They're rewriting stories for their kids to make it relevant for them.
One of my favorite, and like I said, this is an interview that's upcoming, but one of my favorite upcoming interviews, and I call the people and talk to them. One of my favorite upcoming interviews is with a community leader, Kwame Bay, who took it upon himself to write a grant and do a film series to enhance, the learning around African American history that was going on. And this film series that he was doing and these discussions afterward became so popular that they developed a national following. And he just recently won the Forward Push, Rainbow Push Award for being, one of these outstanding heroes of the COVID epidemic. So, I mean, there are people out there who are doing fantastic things in the community that probably never dreamt that people would be doing. And it's just, they have the time to do it. And thankfully, the NEH got the funding to actually fund projects. And a lot of people took advantage of that funding to look at marginalized histories or histories that wouldn't have been told. And that has been wonderful. And really, if you haven't seen any of them, they plan on continually doing them. And they often show brand new documentaries. And they have the producers and people in the documentaries on panels, and their discussions, and scholars come in. I've done a few of them. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful to see that people are engaging, not just watching Netflix 24/7, but they're actually, engaging themselves and trying to learn something different. And it's really refreshing when you see entire families there. I've had a few teacher circles that have contacted me in different little small social groups to ask me to come out and teach during the pandemic, or do a lecture, or discuss housing issues, or discuss race and violence, or discuss politics through the lens of race during the pandemic. And while I have the time, I mean, it's something that I see as worthwhile.
Yeah, absolutely. Stephanie, do you have any particular stories or artifacts or photographs that were really, really sort of evocative for you?
Absolutely. As far as with the photograph, like I know the museum actually had a discussion with Ebony Beck, and her photography was pretty much the lead of what's in the exhibit. But we also Andre Wilson, and we had some painting by Brandon Maddox, actually depicts the African American male holding a sign in the protest, and he's wearing a mask. So, but there's a couple of photographs that we actually did not get a chance to display. It was in Zinc, Arkansas. And so just to hear Ebony actually give her experience about what happened there, I'm not originally from Arkansas, but you know that there are some places that you are told that you may not want to go there. Or, so it was where when she did tell the story, I was surprised, but at the same time, it's like, wow, anything you can, how you made it out of that. So there's some things of that nature. I actually had conducted a few oral histories with some of graduates from Hendrix. And so just to hear their experience, and there is a section in the exhibit that talks about the Black experience at Hendrix. Just to hear their story, to be honest, I really didn't have anything to say, even though I was interviewing them, and I'm really not supposed to say much. I was really speechless with some of the things that I was told. So, but I was glad that they were comfortable to tell their story, and they made a huge impact to the narrative of the exhibit. So there is a lot of things that it's almost having something this big, and then you have to narrow it down to almost this big. But at the same time, used to tell the narrative and tell the story what everybody understands. So it was a lot.
So I think we may be getting more questions from the audience, and we would welcome those. I also, I know we've talked quite a bit about the issue of disparities between, the numbers of people in the Black community and indeed in the Hispanic community as well, and the Pacific Islanders in Arkansas who have gotten COVID. And we talked about all kinds of factors that are involved in that, right? Including the kinds of jobs that people have, and other kinds of things that make members of these communities more vulnerable to the disease. Are there lessons we can learn from the experience of this outbreak that we might use? Because we're probably going to have more outbreaks of disease in the future. Are there things that we can learn to do a better job of responding and protecting vulnerable communities in the future?
So a lot of the things that, as we were talking before, right, were issues that already existed in the community, but that were exacerbated. So, for example, one of the reasons why things like hypertension or high blood pressure or diabetes, right, tend to be higher, particularly like in African-American population, for example, right, or because of food deserts, right, which Arkansas has food deserts, right? You don't have access to quality, nutritious fruits and vegetables. And so you're more likely to eat what's in your neighborhood grocery store, what's close to you, right? And so you're more likely to eat processed food that has high salt content, right? High fat content. And so by getting rid of food deserts, right, by providing people with high quality food, right, that overall can improve someone's health so that if a pandemic comes around again, right, people have a chance to fight it. I mean, that's one of the, I think, biggest challenges of this, right, and why the CDC warns about people with obesity and other kind of at-risk factors, right, is because all of those factors, what they're really doing for you is they're not giving your body a chance to fight the disease. Right. And that at its root is where a lot of the problems in these communities and why they're so hit hit so hard, right? So thinking about issues like that, thinking about, local health departments, local health resources, access to affordable, high quality medical care so that people don't have to wait or be worried about a high doctor's bill, right? They're less likely to go to the doctor for checkups, for yearly checkups, for health checkups and wellness visits, if they know that they're going to get a huge bill they can't pay. And if they get a huge bill they can't pay, now they have two problems, right? They have COVID, right, or some other respiratory illness, right, that's highly contagious, and they have a problem of a high bill. And you've told them now that they can't work, right, that they have to quarantine for 14 days. So now they have another issue that they can't afford their rent. And so, I think one of the challenges and one of the reasons why maybe COVID has hit so hard in the US is partly because of that, because it's opened up these decade-old wounds, right? These decade-old cracks in the country and gaps where people aren't being served, right? And which we're not truly an American for all Americans.
One of the things we have to look at is how many people are actually being affected and what these numbers mean. So let's talk about African Americans in Arkansas. African Americans comprise 15.7% of the population in the state. They are 18% of the infections, so the people that are contracting it. When we talk about deaths, they're 16.2% of all the deaths. So the rates of their deaths are greater than the percentages, their proportion in the population. Now, when you say, let's compare that to what's going on in the white community, Arkansas is comprised of 79%. The population, 79% of the population are whites. 62% of the infections, the people catching COVID, are whites, and only 70% of those who are dying from it are white, and that's far below their proportions in the population. And there are a number of other rates that we can look at that are similar when we start talking about your chances of missing rent payments, or your chances of missing a mortgage payment, or the chances that you'll be evicted, are all higher in the African American community. And there's also one of the things that I was listening to the radio on the way over, and they were talking about people saving because they're not going out to eat, or all the savings that are happening. This isn't happening in the African American community because there's no one working. Before this happened, the largest portion of the people in the poverty line were females and children. These are generally single female-headed families. And if that mother loses her job, then she falls prey to a whole host of issues. First, there's no income coming in. Then she becomes far more vulnerable when we start discussing evictions or foreclosures. So we really have to find a way to, and that's why the stimulus package was so important. Getting another wave of stimulus out to people was so vitally important, and we missed that opportunity. We totally missed that opportunity, and it will have grave effects on families in Arkansas.
I just kind of want to piggyback off of that. I think about, even with some people are able to save, and there's other people who aren't. When you think about with the beginning of the pandemic, think about how difficult it was to just find a. And so when you did actually find a package of tissue paper or soap or anything like that, it was actually the highest name brand. So when you have a family who only brings in about $20,000 a year, that's extra money out of their pocket trying to buy the Brawny brand rather than the Great Value brand, So not only during the pandemic, it was financially hard on a lot of families because you had to buy more food, you had to buy more essentials during that time. And on top of that, you being an essential worker, you were already vulnerable, but you're still not making enough. So that was another thing that was very difficult. But I believe this time with the pandemic, people actually learned a lot of how to create a second income. So like I mentioned earlier, you have people who made masks. You have people who, instead of going out and find out how to make that same dish or just a copycat of that dish at home. You also had certain people who started their own mini gardens. So maybe this is also an opportunity where you kind of start doing things on your own so you can save as much as you possibly can. So that's another thing that aspect that I wanted to bring to light.
Yeah, I was thinking, I hope one of the things that by far, if we can't fix anything else, the idea of fixing this idea of empathy and being courageously empathetic to other people, to seeing other people's stories, to not just seeing and hearing it, but responding in kind. You see these, there have been fridges, right? Community fridges that pop up where people can leave their leftovers, creating these kind of places that, truly can provide a sense of support, right? At the same time that we're working to fix these truly systemic issues and system-wide issues, also being a place that's focused on community, that cares about community. It's, one of the things I think has been really sad that, as a historian, I sort of see it, right, in the longer picture of this idea of we stopped caring about our neighbor. They've stopped mattering to us. And I hope that one of the things that will come out of this is that we'll care about our neighbor, right? Their story, their life, what happens to them will matter, that we'll take care of one another and take care of our communities, right? It's unacceptable in the United States that there are children that still go hungry. That school was their place to eat, and the schools are and some of the schools are closed, right? And so then those kids miss meals. Unacceptable. And so finding ways where we're stepping into that gap again, at the same time when we're trying to fix the system issues, we're as a community stepping into those gaps for people.
Yeah, that has been wonderful. I mean, one of the great things that happened were the school lunches, the notion that they gave the school lunches out even though people were at home, and the number of people that went to schools and the number of people that have volunteered time at food banks is very encouraging, in regard to whether people, we have a really caring community or not. And I've been very impressed by that. But I would also love to see that carry over, into other areas. I wish we could be. I wish the politically we could embrace each other in the same way.
I think this is actually really directly connected to the question that we had from the audience, which is, looking at lessons from history, is it possible that the cultural climate in Arkansas is shifting in a way that feels lasting and actually positive with the awareness that we're now seeing related to disparities, related to the ways that different communities are suffering differently with in terms of actually, the ways that we are finding to reach out to each other and support each other through this kind of crisis, right? A crisis shows us where we have faults, but also maybe shows us where we have strengths as well.
Yeah, so I would say it's a both and thing, right? That it's both good that as individuals that we're doing what we can do, right? We're making, people have made masks, right? They're donating food, they're doing good things that we should do. But I also think that, again, it's a policy issue. A lot of the disparities that Arkansas has have to do with policies in the state. There is no state law that protects renters, right? It protects landlords, but not renters. And so, and that policy, unfortunately, has often been abused, right, by abusive landlords for years, right, who have kicked out tenants for, frankly, like not legitimate reasons. And the law stands on their side. And so until there are some real structural changes, policy, legislative changes, we're going to continue to see these sort of disparities popping up because the law supports it, right? It was the same way that, the United States said that it was okay to be separate but equal, right? That doctrine, and it wasn't until the law was changed that that education had to be, couldn't be separate anymore. Most people don't realize that it actually wasn't the bus boycott, which went on for 381 days, which blows my mind. And when you think about a protest and how long, right, someone is walking to work every day. But the Montgomery bus boycott actually ends because of a court case, right? It doesn't end because of just the protest. The protest was important, but it's a court case that ends the bus boycott. And so it has to be both of those things.
After that, Arkansas is the only one of the very few states where you can be criminalized for not being able to pay your rent. So you can be arrested, charged with a felony, and now you have to deal with not only being broke and homeless, but now being a felon for not being able to pay your rent.
Yeah, the Arkansas Times, I'll give a plug. A couple of years ago, did a really great story on debtors prison. And particularly, they looked at the city of Sherwood and what happened to people who didn't pay, had bounced checks. And what sort of happens to them. And it's a fantastic story to read, just to understand in a quick snapshot about, again, what it means to have maybe unjust laws, right, or the ways in which laws are applied.
Or when we talk about who's paying their fair share, when you find out that people are being preyed upon by municipalities and being levied with taxes and tickets and fines. And then you discover that a huge proportion of the court system is being maintained by those fees and fines. You have to look entirely different at this marginalized population and look at them as an exploited group.
So maybe we can hope that these kinds of issues are coming to the fore and that people are becoming more aware of the ways in which we have put together a system that is structurally creating issues for people that can't be resolved just by helping each other individually, but need to be resolved through systemic change. So I note that it is almost 8 o'clock, and I know that you have lives to get on with. So I want to thank everyone, especially to thank our three panelists for this incredibly rich conversation. I really enjoyed hearing from each of you about the projects that you're doing and about the sort of larger impact of COVID in the state and particularly for the Black community. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the audience for your excellent questions, and have a wonderful evening.